I think you have to take time to appreciate it. And, yep, it has become a job. However, I'd be lying if I didn't say, there are times whenever I finish completing an episode and I sit back and kind of like look at all the work that I edited, and I'm like, I made that. And a guy that had an action figure of as a kid helped me make that. You kind of get that satisfaction with it.
What's going on, guys? It's your boy, Tom Took Trash, and stand back for another interview. This time, completing the DeAngelo's brothers lineup. I'm joined by the one and only Marcus DeAngelo from the Snake Pit podcast with Jake Roberts. So, welcome to the show.
Tom, thank you so much for having me on, man. You're like collecting the DeAngelo Infinity Rings. There's two more siblings.
That's very cool. So, if we take this back, my friend, where do you first discover wrestling as an overall fan?
Well, so when I was very young, like most everybody my age, I was born in 1986. So when I was very young, most kids my age were talking about Hulk Hogan and Jake the Snake Roberts, who I'm now doing a podcast with, and Ted DiBiase and all those guys from that era. So I was a fan, and I liked those guys, and I thought the Big Boss Man was really cool. And then I kind of got out of it for a few years. You flash forward to around 97, 98, and Kevin Nash caught my attention, and
Mm,
next thing you know, I was in with both feet.
mm. That's very interesting because talking to your brother, he was a big Scott Hall guy, and you sort of like both picked one side of a tag team, which I find really interesting.
That's exactly it. I'm a huge Dallas Cowboys fan today, and that's because Dominic decided he really liked Emmett Smith when we were young. And so I continued to be a Cowboys fan. He became a Jets fan. But
Oh wow.
it's basically I just kept following Dominic's lead on stuff because he's my older brother, and so he likes Scott Hall, and I was like, who's Scott Hall's best friend? And it's like, oh, Kevin Nash. Okay, I like him now. And then next
Mm,
thing I'm a huge fan of his, and still am today. I love his work.
So you talk about there following Dominic's lead when it comes to some of your wrestling fandom, but do you remember a moment as kids, and then maybe a moment now that you were like, I like this. And Dominic was like, nah, that's not for me. And maybe vice versa.
Well, the funny thing about Dominic also being my older brother was that when we would play with action figures together, he was always the good guy. Like, so if we played with Batman action figures, he was Batman and I was the Joker, And so it was the same thing with our wrestling toys. So our parents bought us a Hulk Hogan action figure and a Ted DiBiase Hasbro. And so I got the Ted DiBiase because Hulk Hogan needed somebody to oppose him, and so next thing you know, I kind of started liking the heels. So that's where Dominic and I really started to divert, especially in our younger years, where I started to, I was more attracted to the heels because, I had to sympathize with them. I was playing as them.
Mm. So you talk about their playing as the hill. What was maybe from the 80s or maybe even sooner? What was the most despicable hill act that you were like, yeah, this is cool, but you look back now and you was like, nah, why did I like that? That is mean, sort of thing.
Uh, well, it's the one that jumps out to the top of mind is Ted DiBiase kicking the basketball, where it was like, it's kind of funny. The kid almost makes it to the end, and Ted just denies him.
Mm.
Man, Jake Roberts, when he made that change in 1991 and became that stone cold heel, where he had the Cobra bite Randy Savage, and it was just this immediate shift in his promo style. Watching that stuff back now, it's like, holy smokes, it's some of the best promo work I've ever seen, period.
You talk about their watching that stuff back before we get into your work with Jake Roberts, which we will get to. Don't worry, guys, we will get to all that stuff. But like what you talked about, the Attitude Era, sort of coming out of wrestling, sort of, would you say 94?
So I probably stopped watching around, yeah, maybe around 93, 94. And then, just other interests. I was still very young. And then, yeah, I didn't watch one bit of wrestling up until like late 97, early 98.
So, what was it about the Attitude Era that finally brought you back, and you was like, "Yeah, I remember why I love this, and I love this now."
Well, it was I was finally at that age where I started to understand sort of the business of wrestling, and what really drew me in was the idea that these guys were seemingly coming from the WWF, because I knew Scott Hall was Razor Ramon. I was like, wait a minute, so he's over here now? And Dominic kind of explained it to me, like, yeah, so they're sort of like they jump ship and are trying to take over another company, and that's what really drew me in, was that NWO storyline. And then, when the commercial comes up, all of a sudden you change it to Raw, so Nitro's at commercial. Let's see what's going on Raw. And then there's amazing stuff happening over there with Stone Cold and The Rock and DX. So it was like that, the switching of back and forth of channels and just great storytelling is what brought me in.
You talk about there the switching of channels. Your brother discussed was he was one of the many thousands that basically uh, during the Finger Poke of Doom and the Matt Hardy, no, the Mankind uh, show was one of the
Yes.
many thousands that switched over. So was you watching with him at the time?
I was. So it was awesome getting to witness that moment. And yeah, it's, again, I'm this huge Kevin Nash fan, and Kevin Nash is on this channel. But as soon as Tony Schiavone said, "Hey, Mankind is winning," I'm like, well, let's check that out.
Do you talk about there, you being a big Kevin Nash fan, your brother maybe being more of a fan of the WWF in his own words. So was there ever a fight over the controller where you was like, I want to watch this show? Dominic was like, I want to watch this show.
So admittedly, when those channel changes would happen, it was Dominic who had the control. And a lot of times I'd be like, no, no, like, what if it comes back from commercial here on WCW? Like, well, let's stay right here. But Dominic would do this switching back and forth. So that was about as bad as it got, where I'd be like, no, don't change it. Like, what if they come back? What if we miss something,
I understand what you're saying completely there. So what about when you start watching wrestling on your own and developing your own fandom almost like as you and Dominic grow? How do you start developing almost like your own fandom?
Well, I got into wrestling in '98 and probably hung around until maybe 2001, somewhere in there. And then I took another hiatus from watching it. As I got older, I was just getting into high school. So, my interest shifted to girls and sports, so I was doing all that kind of thing. And then it was around the time I got back to college and like YouTube was really starting to take off, that I caught a video of some old wrestling, and it started to get me back into it. I started searching, like, hey, I wonder if I could find this moment. And then I started wondering what was happening in real time with the product. So yeah, I eventually started watching Raw again. I was really drawn to Ken Kennedy right
Hmm.
away. I thought he was great. Randy Orton, of course. So yeah, it's those guys kind of drew me back into professional wrestling.
If you stopped watching from about 2001 till what year, please clarify?
It was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 2007, 2008.
So if you had like a 6 year hiatus, what is something that maybe you've gone back and watched on the network from say 2002 to 2006 that you're like, oh man, I wish I was a fan during this point? And then what is, to flip the question, what is something that you're like, nah, I'm glad I wasn't a fan during this point?
Well, certainly the first thing that jumps to mind is I missed when the NWO came to the WWF in 2002. So here I was, this giant, Hall and Nash and NWO fan, and I missed their run on like the biggest stage in professional wrestling. So that's one thing I wish I could have watched live. Obviously, it didn't turn out that great, but at the time, I can't imagine the excitement I would have had. And one of the things that I'm sort of glad I missed was probably Scott Steiner's run, because I love Scott Steiner. I love Big Papa Pump, and that run was just so underwhelming, and it didn't quite pan out the way that I think we all wanted it to. I'm okay with missing that.
As a big Kevin Nash fan, I'm just going to skip to 2011 quickly. What was your thoughts on him being a part of the Summer of Punk? Where did you want to see it go as a Kevin Nash fan and things like that?
Well, I remember exactly where I was whenever that moment happened. We just happened to rent SummerSlam. I was living, or not rent, but buy the pay-per-view. I was living in Philadelphia with Dominic and my girlfriend at the time, and we were watching. And Kevin Nash came out, and like my jaw just hit the floor. I couldn't believe it, especially with the way that CM Punk was just taking off like a rocket. So seeing that was incredible. The way I wanted it to play out was like, okay, let's string this thing out. Like let's string it out to not just one or even two pay-per-views. Like let's get three pay-per-views out of this thing and really have like a great blow off and have Kevin Nash put him over clean at the end of all of it. And again, kind of reinforce that momentum that Punk had. That's what I wanted to see. And then didn't quite go that way.
What was your thoughts on the Triple H Kevin Nash sledgehammer match?
Of all the matches that you want to get Kevin Nash in, especially at that stage of his career, they selected like a
Uh,
sledgehammer on
a
a
ladder
pole match.
match.
Yeah, a ladder match. Like, what are we doing? And then Kevin Nash takes a bump through a table. It's like, man, this is. I feel like there's a better way to do this. I think in WWE's defense, they were probably like, oh well, neither of these guys are capable of having like a really strong, just regular wrestling match. So we gotta throw in some gimmicks. It's like find another gimmick. I think there were more options.
I fully agree there. So also we should have talked about this beforehand, but my brain doesn't work that way, and my brain just ping pongs.
That's
I
all
do
right. I like
apologize.
bouncing around. I like bouncing
But
around. Go ahead.
you talked about their you also had a first hiatus from wrestling from about 93 to about 97 in your own words. So the same similar question from 2001 to 2007-ish. What is something you missed from the 93-97 era that you're like, oh man, I wish I had seen that? And then what is something that you're like, yep, this is garbage. I'm glad I missed this.
Easily, what I'm disappointed that I missed is it would be like the WrestleMania 10 era where you've got Bret Hart taking on Owen Hart and then ultimately beating Yokozuna and winning, and then of course the ladder match with Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels was iconic. So like being able to say that I watched that live when it happened would have been amazing. As far as what I'm satisfied that I missed, probably something like the Crybaby match from 1996 with Razor and Ted DiBiase and the 1-2-3 kid. It's something like that. It's every time I look at it, I'm like, who in the world thought that this was a good idea? My goodness.
I understand what you're saying completely there. Did your second hiatus from wrestling, as a big WCW fan, did it have a lot to do with WCW finally closing its doors?
Probably. I would say so. That there was that kind of attraction there in like 98, 99, where it was like every night or every Monday, these guys were just trying to one up each other all the time. WWF had some awesome stuff with Stone Cold, like just wreaking havoc and whatever, pouring cement in Vince McMahon's car. And then you'd switch over to WCW and it's like, oh my God, the Ultimate Warrior is here now. So it was they just continually tried to one up each other back and forth. And then once the competition is gone, there's only one game, one show in town, and and to me it's a little bit less attractive.
Mm. You talk about there only being one show in town for the longest time. How did you, when you got back into wrestling for the second time, what did you start discovering side of the WWE, things like that? What was your consumption of wrestling when you got back into it for a second time?
Well, I always really liked, aside from just liking Kevin Nash, I always really liked Jeff Jarrett. I know that he was a heel, but again, Dominic was a Scott Hall fan, and Jeff Jarrett, was had some issues with Scott Hall, in the WWF. That would have been during a time when I wasn't watching, but I had started to watch back the old tapes in '98 whenever I picked wrestling back up. So I was watching the stuff from '95 when Scott Hall and Jeff Jarrett were having these rivalries. So I was a big Jeff Jarrett fan too, and then I found out that he had his own promotion, TNA.
Mm.
And oh my gosh, Kevin Nash is there too, and I think Booker T had come there by that time, and all of a sudden it was like, wow, okay, I'm back in this. So that was, I remember very distinctly the night that the Bret Hart came back to the WWF. That I was switching back and forth between
Wasn't
TNA.
that like the TNA start of the TNA wars, for lack of a better
Yes,
word?
yeah,
Yeah.
that very short-lived Monday Night War, reignited thing.
3 weeks, if I remember correctly. If I've got that wrong, Please do not gut me in the comments, guys. Like my brain doesn't work that well, but I believe it was 3 weeks.
Yep, I it was something like that. You know, I'm also a producer for Jeff Jarrett's podcast, My World. So I know that he did an episode on that. So I may have to dig back into the archives myself and find out.
You talk about your work within wrestling media, which is a beautiful segue. How do you go from getting back into it as a fan to going, it'd be cool to work in this? Like podcasting's quite big at this point. How do you get into that point where it's like, it'd be cool to work in this?
You know, it's as I, completed college and started, my work, in the real world, just working a regular job. It's the thought occurred to me many times where I was like, how cool would it be to be like working behind the scenes? How cool would it be to be influencing creative, or like even just doing social media or helping them market? I was thinking of all that sort of thing. And it can be tough to get a foot in the door in professional wrestling because it's a desirable job. A lot of people want to make their money doing this. And so for years I just kind of chalked it up to a pipe dream and left it at that. Well, it was 2021. I was doing a job search and it just happened to be scrolling social media and saw that Ad Free Shows was hiring a guy to do social. And I was working in marketing at the time and I had experience in social media. So I was like, well, okay, I'll apply. So I applied, but then here was the real key. Dominic had been working as a wrestling journalist at that time. And
Hmm.
so I reached out to Dominic and I was like, hey, have you heard of this guy that works for Ad Free Shows? His name is Evan Polisher. And Dominic was like, yeah, I know him. And I was like, well, I just applied for a job and I think he's the hiring manager. Could you put in a word for me? And Evan Polisher emailed me that night. And that's when my career took off in podcasting.
You talk about your brother putting in a word for you. We all have had, well, let's be honest, we've all had family that have put in words for us when it comes to jobs and stuff like that. So, did you ever have sort of any reservations of maybe they've just hired me because they've heard of Dom and stuff like that? Or did you always want to be like, yes, Dom got me hired, maybe, but I want to let my work speak for itself?
That second thing you said is exactly it. Dominic opened up the door. It was up to me whether or not I was going to push my way through the door and then, show them that I was worthy of being there. And, if I can give a piece of advice to listeners right now who maybe want to work in professional wrestling, want to work in the NFL, want to work in television or any form of entertainment, here's the best advice that I could possibly give you. If you really love something, you're going to be willing to do it for free for a while. And by that I mean, when I first got hired with Ad Free Shows, it was kind of on a trial basis, and I was not getting paid. I was just doing social media for a few of their accounts and just kind of showing my stuff there and getting paid in experience more than
Hmm.
in money, which let me say is more valuable. And that's how you get your foot in the door. If you truly love something, do it for free. Go up to people, ask people, send emails, say, let me help. I don't need any money, just let me help you. And next thing you know, it's whenever they do need somebody for a paid position, you're going to be top of mind.
Hmm. So you talk about there being top of mind and things like that. What you talk about some advice that you give for people. What would be your sort of, I don't want to say don'ts because that sounds too negative. You talk about your do's there, but let's go with don'ts. What would you say your don'ts are for people trying to get into the podcasting world?
Don't be a guy who comes up with problems, and by that I mean even if there's a problem with something, and like I've never been one to come back to somebody in management and say like, well, I can't do that because XYZ. I would come to management and say, well, I've bumped into a problem here, but here's how I intend to solve it. Come up with a game plan, be creative, try to, and so that would probably be my best advice. Don't come up with excuses, come up with ways to work around all of the speed bumps you're going to encounter.
The way I'll phrase it, the advice I was given when I first started, which was don't come up with more problems, come up with solutions for the problems.
That is a way better way to put it.
I'm not, I just like, I like throwing that quote in when I can. I'm not going to lie.
Absolutely. No, that's a great one.
So you talk about their working for ad-free shows on a trial basis and things like that. So how do you and Dominic eventually start going, okay, we can now podcast together, sort of thing?
Well, it's that story is interesting because I got hired strictly to do social media, and Dominic would say to me from time to time, because Dominic, we had done a podcast for WrestleZone, actually a couple podcasts for WrestleZone, and had some experience podcasting. So Dominic would say like, hey, why don't you throw your name out there to help add free shows with a podcast? And I was like, really, I'm not very interested. I was like, I'm happy doing what I'm doing, so I'm good, but thank you. But then it sort of came to me. DDP Snake Pit was getting ready to go away, and Jake and I had developed a relationship. I met Jake when I was in Dallas in 2022 around WrestleMania time, and Jake and I had become buddies and exchanged information. And so when DDP Snake Pit was getting ready to go away, I threw out there to Conrad, like, hey, it's I could pick up the helm with Jake. And next thing you know, Jake and I are podcasting. And then Jake hooked me up with Ted DiBiase, who I now have a podcast with.
Everybody's got a pod, right?
Yes.
So you talk about their podcasting with some legends within the business. How do you sort of keep your professional head on when it's like, I grew up as fans of these guys? You talk about remembering Jake having a snake bite people's arms and things like that. How do you keep your professional head on when it comes to podcasting because of that?
Well, really what it boils down to is that it's become a job, which means that there's clear-cut goals and objectives now, and things that I have to complete within a certain time frame. So when I've got the actual job where I'm like, hey, look, I've got a daughter who's about to turn 3 years old. I've got a wife. I've got a mortgage. So now all of a sudden, this has turned from a hobby into the way that I pay bills. So I don't really, I'm always going to be a fan of wrestling, and I love the guys that I work with. I still love and admire their work, but it's at this point, I'm like, it's a job, and
Mm.
that's how I keep it all in perspective.
That's very cool. You talk about it being a job. I'm very interested in like burnout with my guests because we all suffer from it as content creators, right? With
Sure.
it being a job in your own words, how does Marcus make sure I'm still a fan of wrestling, even though I'm doing a lot within wrestling for my work?
I think you have to take time to appreciate it. And, yep, it has become a job. However, I'd be lying if I didn't say, there are times whenever I finish completing an episode and I sit back and kind of like look at all the work that I edited, and I'm like, I made that. And a guy that I, had an action figure of as a kid helped me make that. You kind of get that satisfaction with it. And that's one of the things that helps keep me going. You talk about burnout. It's some days vary. Some days I work a regular 8-hour day, just like everybody else. Some days I wake up at 7 in the morning and I don't stop working until 1 in the morning. So it all just depends on the day and the workload and what I've got coming up. But really it's I always tell my wife, I feel like I'm pushing this giant boulder up a hill, and it can be tough at times, but once I'm up at the top of the hill and I get to look back down, it feels pretty great.
How do you talk about your wife and your daughter there? What have you put in place because you are such a fan of, we'll call it professional boundaries? Have you put like times that you'll be like, nope, sorry, I'm not going to record at this time, or I'm not going to edit because my daughter's got a performance, I'm taking my wife out to dinner, things like that.
Sure. It really it's the guys that I work with respect me like I respect them. And we ask each other. Nobody gives each other deadlines or says like, hey, we have to record by XYZ. Really what it comes down to is we respect each other, and in these texts or conversations we have, we say, okay, when's the next time you're able to record? Oh, I can't do that. Okay, that one works. And then we both just kind of write it down on our end, and we catch up the following week.
Mm, I understand what you're saying completely there. With you being such a fan of Jake the Snake growing up, what
Mhm.
was the topic that you were like, oh, goody, we get to cover this week? What was the one that you were almost fanboying's the wrong word, but I know what I mean. Do you know what I
I
mean?
I do. I understand what you're saying. We actually just did this episode. It's not the most recent one, but the one before, where Jake teaches Warrior the dark side. So if you remember, those are all those vignettes where he's got Warrior in a coffin and he's making him dig a grave, and then he makes him come through the room filled with snakes. And so, like, I'm a fan of horror movies, a big fan of horror movies, especially kind of the cheesy 80s style horror movies. And so, like, here's a guy that, is one of my favorite wrestlers in Jake the Snake, and he's basically in a horror movie, or at least that's sort of the vibe, with the Ultimate Warrior in 3 vignettes. And so, yeah, Jake and I recently did that episode. We watched it back, and Jake was laughing the whole time. I was laughing, and it was just really fun to get to watch that back with him.
That's very, very cool. How does it work then with coming up with topics? Does Jake say to you, okay, I'd love to talk about this week? Do you bring the topics to him? Is it a collaborative effort? Vice versa.
I will often bring the subjects to him, just because, so I've got a giant chart of, it's like a timeline of Jake's career, where I can see, like, okay, well, in September of 1991 he was doing this, and then in September of 89 he was doing this. And so I'll kind of select them based on that, where it's like, okay, this happened, whatever, 27 years ago at this time, so let's talk about that. But every once in a while, Jake will say, like, hey, I have some really good stories about Rick Martel, or I have some really good stories about this or that. And so, yeah, it's a collaborative effort.
That's very, very cool. We all know, and I'm trying to be very respectful about how I phrase this question, but
Sure.
we all know that Jake has had his struggles with addiction and
Hmm.
things like that. And you talk about having a timeline of his career there. How do you approach the more sensitive subjects when it comes to this is in the timeline of his current, we're in this current timeline, but I don't want to bring it up maybe, or are you like, this will be interesting? How do you bring the sensitive stuff up?
I think, as with anything, especially when it deals with somebody's personal life, so the same thing goes for talking about someone's marriage, or talking about someone's childhood, because some people don't want to talk about their childhoods. I think that you just have to approach it with uh with respect, and be gentle about it, so really, I guess probably the approach that I take when it comes to Jake is, I will ask him ahead of time, like, hey, so in this episode, some of the research I did happens to mention whatever, like an arrest, or an issue that you encountered. And Jake, fortunately, is in a place in his life where he wants to help others prevent making the mistakes that he made. And if that means that he's got to go back and relive some stories that are difficult at times, Jake is very often willing to do that, because he wants to show people, like, hey, look, I made a lot of mistakes, but then after I made all the mistakes, I got to hold my grandchild while I was inducted into the Hall of Fame, you know?
That's very, very cool. And I'd completely forgot about that. I'm not going to lie. So, what about we talk about how you keep yourself motivated when it comes to podcasting? Actually, no, we didn't. How do you keep yourself motivated when it comes to podcasting if you are feeling burnt out? How do you remind yourself, like, how do you get into that zone to podcast? Is the way I phrase it.
Yeah, look, it's with any job, sometimes you have these really lofty expectations of how something's going to go, or how somebody's going to react to your work, and it doesn't always work. So, for example, I'll get on YouTube and I'll post a clip that I really expect to do incredibly well. And it doesn't always work. Sometimes it doesn't get as many clicks as I want. Sometimes I'll put out an episode that I'm really, really proud of, and I'm like, oh, this one's going to get a ton of downloads, and it doesn't quite meet expectations. And it's really easy to get in your head, and that doubter that we all have inside of us, where it tries to kind of make us feel bad about ourselves and tries to make us give up. It always happens, but Kurt Angle recently talked on his podcast about having a coach that said his motto was do it anyway. And that's kind of my mantra, is, look, it's if sometimes it's 1 in the morning and I don't feel like working, but I do it anyway. And sometimes things don't go well with one of my podcasts that I put out, and I don't feel like doing research for the next podcast, because I'm like, well, probably nobody will listen to this one either, or not as many people as I want will listen to this one either. I do it anyway. And that's another good bit of advice I can give to those listening right now, is, look, you're going to have setbacks in everything you do. Just do it anyway. Keep doing the work, because if you do the work, good things are going to happen eventually.
Mm. You talk about there how you keep yourself motivated. What about on those days? I'm sure Jake's had them because he's human, where he's
Sure.
like, we keep talking about Jake. I should ask about Ted DiBiase as well. But
That's okay.
when both of them are like, "Oh, we agreed to record, but I'm tired," or something, how do you keep your I don't know if guests or co-hosts is the right word. You pick what word you're looking for. Like, how do you keep them motivated to record, sort of thing?
Sure, it's and yeah, we do all have down days and days where we're just not in the mood to record, or like especially Jake, he's keeping busy as ever. He's on the road a lot. He still works for AEW. So, it doesn't always work out. And sometimes he'll get on and I'll say, "How you doing, man?" And he'll say, "Oh, dude, I'm exhausted." And all I try to do is lighten the mood. I try to make him laugh, or I say something silly to him before we get going to kind of get him perked up and feeling good. And then we do our recording. And look, it's if he's not in the mood sometimes it's a pretty short recording. But every once in a while, he'll be in a bad mood, or he'll be tired. And once we get talking about things, he'll start to remember stories, and you can kind of see him start to perk up and get back into it. And it's the same thing with Ted. Ted is always pretty much ready to go. He's a self-starter and motivated, but really it just boils down to, again, kind of remembering that, like, yes, there are objectives that we have to complete here, and I've got to get this podcast out by such and such a day, but I'm dealing with another human being. And so anytime you're in that position, always show respect. That's probably the best way I can put it. I always approach it with respect.
Hmm. You talk about respect there. Have you and Jake or you and Ted ever disagreed on how to approach a subject? And you've just got, and what do you do in that scenario where you respect these guys' work so much, but maybe you're more experienced when it comes to podcasting? How do you sort of go about those situations?
Sure. There have been times when I brought up a topic to Jake and he's like, "Yeah, I don't really have much to say about that," or "I don't really want to discuss that particular moment." And ordinarily the way that I put it is like, "Hey man, I'm willing to do whatever it is you want to do. I'll do new research and get us a new episode, and I don't mind doing that stuff. But here's why I think that this episode could, get us a bunch of clicks or get a lot of people interested." And ordinarily it's we always see eye to eye when it comes to that sort of thing.
Hmm. You brought up, I'm always curious to know because I like getting my guests to put things out into the universe. Obviously, you do two great podcasts currently with Ted DiBiase and Jake the Snake, but put it out into the universe, Marcus. If Comrade said to you, you can pitch a podcast to anyone, who would you want to pitch it to and why?
Man, it's the I would say that the easy answer for me right now is Hulk Hogan. Because it's right now I've got two of the biggest stars of the golden era with Jake Roberts and Ted DiBiase. If I could do something with somebody like Hulk Hogan, man, that is the biggest star of the golden era of professional wrestling. So that's kind of what I'm trying to explore in my podcasting, is like, let's go back and look at these days that it's called the golden era for a reason, right? I don't recall there being a platinum era or a diamond era ever since. It's the golden era. So that's the area I want to explore, and man, there wouldn't be many people better to explore that with than the guy who is the biggest star of that era.
I understand what you're saying completely there. So, what do you think? Obviously, you're very experienced in podcasting and stuff. What do you think your guests have maybe taught you? Because they're like two of the best promos in the business when it comes to speaking, and then vice versa. What do you think you've taught them about podcasting?
What they've taught me, I would say, is patience. So, as the host of a podcast, I think that we all feel kind of obligated to keep the conversation going. So if there's like a little lull, or something like that, it's I don't know about you, but I'm like, I don't like the idea of having dead air, where somebody's like quiet for an extended period
Mm,
of time. So I'll try to fill that air, and a lot of times when I try to fill that air, I have interrupted Jake when he's just taking a pause in the story. Same thing with Ted. So what they've taught me is patience. Sometimes you've just got to lay out and let people do their thing. And I had those pitfalls early on with Jake. I learned quickly, forced myself to learn quickly, like, hey, look, when he takes a pause, that doesn't always mean it's my turn to talk. Sometimes you've just got to let this thing ride. And if that means that I have 10 seconds of silence, then so be it. I'll edit it out or whatever.
mm. What about what do you think they've taught you?
You mean I've taught them?
Sorry, but you've taught them. Sorry,
Yeah.
we just did that one. I do apologize.
No, it's okay. I guess probably more than anything, it's it's to appreciate some moments from their career. It's funny watching some of this stuff back. I do a lot of watch along stuff on my podcasts. And so watching back some of this stuff, it's I can see Jake, like he'll be like leaning in to watch, and all of a sudden he'll start getting this giant grin on his face. Same thing with Ted, where it's like, these guys were moving so fast and so hard at that time that they didn't have time to catch the replay on TV. So
Mm.
a lot of this stuff is they did it once and they've never seen it ever again ever since. They might see a clip of it when they're watching WWE if they're showing highlights or something, but that's it. So when I'm watching back some of these old matches, you can see these guys really start to appreciate their promos and these moments, and kind of come to life and remember, like, oh yeah, I did do that, and that was really fun.
Mm. What has been, I think we have to go there now. What has been the biggest giant grin moment you've seen from either of them?
The biggest what?
Giant, you said giant grin in your own words.
Oh,
What has been
okay.
the biggest giant grin moment you've seen from both of them?
So Ted and I went back and watched some of his stuff with Junkyard Dog. We did a full episode on Junkyard Dog because this year marks 25 years ago that he passed away. And
Wow.
so, yeah, I know, and June 98. And so Ted and I were watching back some of his stuff with Junkyard Dog, and we watched the moment where Ted turned heel on Dog. So Ted had been a babyface in the territory, and for years and years at this point, he had been a babyface, and then all of a sudden, he turns on the most beloved star in the entire territory, and you could just see the Ted grinning ear to ear because, man, it worked really, really well in front of that audience.
Mhm.
And when it comes to Jake, it's got to be there are two moments that really stick out. So I just brought up the watching back the date Jake teaching Warrior the dark side. He loved watching that back with me because, again, he had never seen it, and then here all of a sudden you're watching yourself in like basically a low budget horror movie. So he loved watching that. Probably one of my favorite moments on the podcast was we went back and watched his 2014 Hall of Fame induction. And when it was done, Jake had tears in his eyes. I had tears in my eyes. It was just a really beautiful, beautiful moment between him and his grandchild, and just such an incredible moment of redemption for a guy who's honestly a wonderful human being in Jake.
Mm. That's very, very cool. Before, as we look at wrapping this up pretty soon, because I want to be respectful of your time, Mark, so I'm not going to
Sure.
lie. And
No, no
I've
problem.
really appreciated this conversation. I'm not going to lie.
No
If
problem.
this was all to end tomorrow and say Jake was like, okay, I've told my story, I've had enough, Ted was the same, etc. Uh, would you be happy with what you've accomplished within the wrestling media? And what would you want your legacy to be within the wrestling media?
Certainly, I'd be satisfied with how everything has gone. It's been a really fun ride, and I hope that I can get the ride to continue. But if it doesn't, I'm proud that I can look back and, thank goodness for YouTube and the internet, because it provides me an opportunity. It's basically like a photo album of my podcasts here with these guys, and they'll live forever. So that's something that I'm really proud of. And what was the second question again?
If it was to end tomorrow, what would you want your legacy in
My
wrestling media?
legacy. I hope that my legacy is that I introduce new fans to these guys and show fans who maybe had some preconceived notions about either Jake or Ted, and show them what wonderful people they are, because truly they are both absolutely wonderful human beings, two of the nicest men I've ever met, and two guys that have truly influenced and helped my career.
That's very, very cool. I need to get better at segues. I do apologize,
No, no,
but
no, it's
but
fine.
you. We talked about earlier that basically Jake and Ted have both said no topic is off limits, sort of thing. They're both quite open with their past and stuff. Have there been requested topics by fans that you're like, nope, never touching this, sort of thing?
Nothing has really come up yet. I think that's looking back at some of the moments that highlight negative parts of their careers, would probably be something that I would actively avoid. I can't really think of anything specific off the top of my head, but really it's just anything that puts them in a negative light, because we're not doing this necessarily to look back at the low points. Now look, we discuss the low points, we discuss everything in between. However, I don't see a need to have an entire episode featuring a very low point where we can discuss the low points that happen sort of in between.
Mm, mm. There's one that I'll ask you about off camera because I don't want there to be like an awkward moment, but I am just curious to know and it will satisfy
Sure,
my own
sure.
curiosity. I'm not gonna lie. But as we look at wrapping this up, Marcus, because like I say, I do want to be respectful of your time. We're
No
gonna
problem.
do a segment that I call generic questions. Those of you that have seen my interviews before, this is where I ask my guests the questions they might get asked on social media, such as Marcus's favorite match, favorite pay-per-view. When I say pay-per-view, I mean Double or Nothing 2019, for example. Favorite wrestler's entrance music, favorite tag team, and favorite wrestler. Basically, questions that Marcus might be asked on social media. So now he'll have a place to be like, guys, I have answered this. Please go watch this. So, what's your favorite overall match of all
My favorite match of all time. Well, I guess from a work standpoint, it would probably be Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 12 because they just, both remarkable workers. I know that the match was a little long for some people, but every time I watch it back, I don't get bored. But just from a memory standpoint, most people laugh when I tell them this. It was Kevin Nash versus the Giant at Sold Out 98 when Kevin Nash broke the Giant's neck. Mostly just because I was a kid and that moment really, really stuck out to me.
time? That's very, very cool. Like I say, what about your favorite overall pay per view?
Hog Wild 1996. Sturgis. I just love the fact that it was such a cool setting. They were outdoors, just something so new and so different. And just the buildup and the vibe, and the main event where Hulk Hogan sprays NWO on the belt after he beats the Giant. Actually, today as we're recording it is August 10th, so it's the anniversary of that event.
Oh wow, the podcast on that maybe one day, maybe.
As a matter of fact, on a podcast coming up here, Jake had to miss because he was traveling, but I'm always committed to bringing people fresh content on the show, so I will bring on guests to fill in for Jake. I had Hacksaw come in and do a show with me. I had Raven come in and do a show. And now my most recent one is going to be Medusa. Medusa came on and we were talking about Hog Wild 1996.
That's very, very cool. I'll be honest, that will probably be out by the time this goes out because I do like to backlog my content, as we were saying off camera.
Sure.
But as we continue, what about your favorite wrestler's entrance music of all time?
Entrance music. You've got to go with Razor Ramon there. He had just the coolest entrance music, probably of all time.
Very, very cool. What about your favorite tag team of all time?
Favorite tag team. I've got to go with Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. Those guys were just unbelievable in the ring and such great storytellers.
And then finally, the biggest generic question, I believe, Marcus, who is your favorite overall wrestler?
Well, you know that one already. It's probably Kevin Nash just because of the nostalgia of growing up. But really, I have to say it is very quickly turning into either Jake or Ted. As I go back and watch their work for our podcast and for research, it's man, you get to see just like kind of this. They're both second generation stars, and so you can kind of
Oh
really see.
yeah,
Yeah, Jake's father was in wrestling, Ted's father was in wrestling, and you can just see that like no matter what happens in the ring, anything could go wrong, and those guys can handle it. They know exactly what to do to get out of it and continue the match and get the finish that they need. And just seeing two masters of their craft like that, it's very quickly turning into those two.
that's very, very cool. And then finally, as we wrap this up, Marcus, you talked about the internet being a time capsule and living forever on, as we were talking earlier. I believe, as content creators like yourself, we are going to live forever in some sort of very strange way if you think about the world. So, what is
Sure.
one piece of content you're like, I would like to be remembered for that? And then what is one that you're like, please forget about that. I don't want to be remembered for that.
Well, so far so good. I haven't really had any that I regret or that I think were bad. So as of right now, I don't really have an answer for the second one. And I think that maybe for the first one, it might be Jake and I went back and looked at June 1985 on an early episode where we talked about him with Muhammad Ali in Mid-South Wrestling and like a very infamous run in between those two. And that podcast always really stuck out to me just because it was so cool to hear Jake's history with a guy that he grew up admiring in Muhammad Ali, and now all of a sudden he's sharing the ring with him, and Jake is kind of torn between, hey, I love this guy, but how much should I put this guy over without hurting myself and my career? So it's, if you haven't heard that one, I suggest you go back and listen because it's really fascinating.
That's very, very cool, Marcus. And this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm not going to lie. Obviously, I want to say thank you for a great conversation, but promote yourself. Where can the good people find you, your content, social media, etc.?
Yeah, and by the way, I've had a great job. You've been a great host, so I truly appreciate you having me on here. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Marcus P. DeAngelo. I would love to get you guys to follow my accounts on YouTube. We do tons of giveaways on both channels for both Jake and for Ted. We're actually in the middle of a giveaway right now for Ted. And it still will be by the time this thing goes up because it's going to go until the end of the month. But please go to YouTube at youtube.com/ at snake pit pod, and then go to youtube.com/ at everybody's got a pod. And yeah, please like, subscribe, comment, check it out. I'm not one of those guys who can't take suggestions or criticism. If you don't like something I'm doing, if you think I could do something better, if you want to see things on the podcast, please comment, let me know. I want to hear from you guys.
It's well worth doing, guys. As I always seem to be saying lately, one of probably my favorite creators and one of the hardest working out there currently, but one of the nicest as well. So if you guys like this video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Tom Talk Trash on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter at Tom Talk Trash, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye now.